Okay, here we go. Thank you, Sarah, for the wonderful endgame presentation. And this is me, Grandmaster Illia Nyzhnyk, and I'm about to show you guys a lecture on how to trade pieces properly, and obviously what to look for when you're making this very, very important decision. You know, one may believe that trading pieces is kind of a way to release the pressure in the position and kind of get yourself into a more calm streams of an endgame, but that's not usually that's not the case. Usually that's not what ends up happening. And today I would like to present to you a couple of examples to demonstrate what do we need to look for when we are making a decision to trade something, and you know, what to be aware of, and you know, other factors that go into this kind of decision making. So first example, let's get to it. This game was played a couple of days ago during the chess Olympiad, and a little bit of a backstory for this position. So I believe that this position happened around move 30, 31, 32-ish, and player with black pieces, it's black to play by the way, player with black pieces had almost no time left on his clock, and finding himself in this dynamic position where black is down in exchange for a piece and a pawn. Grandmaster Brkic Ante, understandably so, made a foul decision to trade off his bishop for this knight, right? So kind of making sure that he doesn't end up blundering something, as there is pressure going on in this g file, with white currently attacking the g5 a whole bunch of times. So while this decision is understandable, if we obviously, you know, since he had no time left on his clock to think about it, you know, mistakes like these will happen quite often when you get yourself into time pressure. So it's hard to blame him for his choice. But once again, if we kind of take a look at this position a little bit more closely, we will probably rather quickly see that our bishop is actually one of our strong pieces, right? I already see some suggestions in the chat. Ansco 1999, I'm afraid that your suggestion is unfortunately not great, because yeah, once again, let's take a look at Ansco's suggestion of knight to d4. And once again, this is the kind of move that first of all we need to calculate this kind of move very carefully, because if this doesn't work, we end up losing on the spot. Obviously, queen takes d7 runs into knight takes f3, and now if rook takes f3, queen takes f3, which is looking fantastic for black, right? Kind of making sure that that we build up a battery on this long diagonal. So while I do like the idea of knight d4, I'm afraid that here there's something white can do, something simple in fact, and that is to just go ahead and take on d4, I believe. And after rook takes d4, is it something that white can do? There should be something better, as far as I know. Trading the knight, yeah, trading the knight on d4 could be okay, but yeah, as I'm looking at, you know, cheating a little bit, looking at the ancients evaluation, it looks like black is actually beginning to threaten the queen c6, and actually, you know, the compensation is quite solid, with white having to play like a weird looking move like f4. Yeah, so the position is getting into a rather unclear point. So yeah, I'm not quite sure. So here knight d4, oh yeah, okay, so knight takes g5 seems to be a tactic that we have missed. Honestly, I haven't seen knight takes g5 myself. Supposedly after h takes g5, queen takes d7, knight f3, king f1. And I guess the difference between white doing this right away after knight d4 and white doing it this way is that white just ends up picking up an extra pawn, right? So just taking on g5 first yields white an extra pawn, and it looks like black doesn't really have a decent enough follow-up, because now after knight h2, let's say king e2, bishop a6, king d1. Apparently black is about to run out of checks here. Not a very obvious line, and once again extremely hard to calculate. Maybe Grandmaster Ante Brkic managed to see this line and therefore decided that it's not worth it. It's not worth the trouble trying to maintain the pieces on the board, and went for a relatively simple and straightforward trade. But once again, I feel like you guys would agree that since black is down material currently, the rule of thumb is that when we are down material, trading into an endgame is not a good idea, typically. Obviously, there are exceptions, and the fact that the position is relatively close here, so this is what happened in the game. I'm going to demonstrate it to you guys. After rook d4, queen h5, queen g6, queen takes, king takes, white found a very nice move h5, and maybe Grandmaster, once again, Grandmaster Brkic Ante saw this position and believed that because of the close nature of his pawn structure on the queen side, white's rooks are going to be unable to join into the fight. As the game progressed, I don't have the rest of the game here. His decision was proven to be wrong, as one way for white to make progress here is to try and trade off one pair of rooks in a d file. I think that's what white eventually went for, and black ended up losing. So especially in cases when we are down material, we want to make sure that we keep just enough pieces to assure appropriate compensation for the missing material, right? So in here, I feel like you guys would agree, actually going back to Ansko 1999's suggestion of knight d4, you guys would probably all agree that, let me actually get rid of all these arrows, way too many arrows on the screen. Yeah, so knight d4 is a great idea, right? Given that we can maintain the knight on d4, right? So if we can put the knight on d4 without losing something, immediately, and given that white's knight probably is not going to be on f3, right, then our knight on d4 is actually going to be applying a lot of pressure. So one of the potential plans, and that's going to be a combination of plans, right, because we do have a problem, right? The g5 pawn is currently being attacked, and I feel like if you make like a random move here, something like bishop a8, we will end up losing as our king becomes extremely exposed, right? So this kind of forces us to think in terms of how can we defend ourselves against the threats on the g file, while at the same time trying to push the f3 knight away, right? So our goal right now is to not overtrade pieces as we are down material, while also at the same time defending ourselves from attacks against the g5 pawn and trying to get rid of the f3 knight at the same time. Can you guys think of a move that should help us with all of these aforementioned factors? Cotton 26 suggested rook d6, but I believe that this suggestion was made before my explanations, and this move helps against the rook e6, h takes g5 kind of tactics, right? This move definitely helps. I can see it because now rook takes e6 doesn't work, as we're gonna take, and this position is actually quite bad for white, as they can no longer take on g5 with a knight due to a checkmate on the first rank. So rook d6 is definitely one of the possibilities, and this is actually a kind of move that doesn't make any significant changes in the position, which once again would be okay, as we still maintain pretty reasonable pressure on the long diagonal here, thanks to our bishop on b7. But rook d6, it's not helping immediately, right? It takes care of white's threats, but it doesn't help us make any kind of progress. At this point, we have a move that's going to do everything for us. It's going to defend us against the threats on the g file. It's going to help us kick the f3 knight out, maybe not immediately, but in a couple of moves, given that we understand how it's done, right? So the f3 knight is currently being defended by, once again, a lot of white pieces. Keep forgetting how to draw arrows. So white has two defenders, we currently have two attackers. If we add an additional attacker, then that will be forced to leave. And as we discovered, going knight d4 is not the way to go, because it's, first of all, because it's a blunder, but secondly, because it potentially also invites some trades. So if we are trying to, once again, make the f3 knight leave while also defending ourselves, what move comes to mind? Let me get rid of these for you. No, again, wrong color. Steve, rook to d5. Wonderful, exactly. So while according to the engine, rook d6 also equalizes for black, once again, following my logic, rook d6 doesn't do anything besides defending, right? Rook d5 does both defending and attacking, as we are not threatening rook f5. The funny thing is that in this position, white actually has to be very, very careful, because once rook f5 happens, knight goes away, we end up playing knight d4, and white is the one who needs to be careful, because we're going to be threatening a lot of things. And this is why here one of white's best responses to rook d5 is to actually play wait, why is there no, like, I actually don't have the move that I'm trying to show you guys. That move is rook to e5, and for some reason I don't have it in the file, even though it should. Wait, no, not rook e5. I'm so confused. Rook e5 would be okay if not for knight d4, and actually knight d4 just wins material because we're hitting a defender of the rook. So rook e5 is not it. Maybe it's knight e5? Yeah, it was knight e5, right. So knight e5 doesn't really allow knight d4, because if we play knight d4 this time, knight takes f7, which may once again force us to calculate a lot of different lines. And yeah, luckily for us, there is a way for us to make a draw, but this is not something I would advise doing, especially when we are in time trouble. So this supposedly this position is okay for black, and yeah, I wouldn't be able to calculate this. Honestly, I feel like even with reasonable amount of time on my clock, I wouldn't have gone for this, because it just feels odd, just feels unnatural. So instead of quote unquote gambling with knight d4, we can probably go for a rather timid rook d2. Well, timid, like very straightforward idea. We're just hitting f2, and after rook e2, there is actually a way to make a draw by force, which I'm pretty sure Grandmaster Ante Brkic would be very happy about, and kind of prove their point, right? So rook takes e2, rook takes e2, knight d4. Now we're hitting the pawn on b3, so white's next response is forced. Rook e3, and here we do have just a threefold repetition after knight c2. The rook actually has nowhere to go, only the e2 square is available. Some flies, knight d4, and this is the draw. So took me a while to get to the right answer, but once again, just to remind you guys, especially in positions where you are in a situation with material imbalance, right? You are down material, but you have compensation. It's clear some of your pieces might be better than your opponents. Make sure you don't trade away your good pieces, right? If you're thinking about which pieces in our position are good, bishop and b7 definitely meets the criteria, right? It's a bishop on an open diagonal, doesn't have an opponent, right? White doesn't have a squared bishop of his own. That alone should give us an idea that might be potential for counterplay. So we don't want to be trading our good pieces for our opponents. Knight on f3 is actually a pretty good piece, so we can make an argument that we're trading our good bishop for white's good knight, and yet once again, this is where the idea comes into play, that we don't want to trade into the endgame when we're down material. So those are the two major factors that should have stopped Grandmaster Brkic from going for this exchange. But once again, because of the time trouble, he likely felt the need to simplify so that he doesn't blunder something in time trouble. How is he not Nick Fuentes? Who is Nick? Who is that? Is that someone I absolutely need to know about? Tell me about him. What is he known for? Anyway, hopefully this makes sense. Now let's go ahead and move on to example number 2. This should also be looked at from black side. And this game also happened during this chess Olympiad. My question for you is, what do you guys think about trading queens with queen to c4? I'm gonna give you guys a couple of minutes to think about it, and I'll give you my explanation. Once again, if you guys have some thoughts, please feel free to write them down in chat so that we can go through your thinking process and hopefully improve on it. Okay, Steve, logic is clear, logic is correct. Now, if that's how it is, so Steve is claiming that if we end up losing the d6 but winning the c2, this doesn't seem all that bad because our rook is active, our rook is hitting the bishop, our knight is pretty good, it's hitting the e4. We can't win e4 as of right now because, you know, the d7 knight is under attack, but this feels a little bit unclear, and I myself have a tough time saying or figuring out who is better here. This would be, okay. If something like this happens, we are happy as black. Unfortunately, queen c4 was played in the game, and unfortunately, after queen takes c4, knight e3, exactly, J.M. Nicholson. Knight e3 is a very strong intermediate move, as it is now forcing black to take on e4, given that black wants to trade the pawns. If the rook takes on e4, it gets stuck there, right? It physically can't move out, and I'm pretty sure that it shouldn't be too difficult for white to just trap it. Maybe something like rook e1 followed by f3, and the rook is gone. Actually, yeah, as you can see here, the engine says that black is completely lost now, as the rook is not coming out. And so now after knight e3, as black, we are essentially forced into the following position, right? Rook c6, b5, rook c7, f3, rook e6. And after a4, while I do not have the rest of the game here, as you guys can see, this is likely not the kind of position black wants to find himself in, as it's way too passive, right? So we have a weakness. We have a weak pawn on d6 that requires constant protection. We will be, as black, we will be struggling to defend this pawn on d6, as white has a couple of very simple ways to start hitting it. Bishop a3, doubling on a d file, knight can potentially come to c4 at some point. Also, with white's last move a4, there is an idea of breaching through on the a file and also infiltrating using the rook that's already there. So all in all, what we did to ourselves is we forced ourselves to play this game passively for the rest of the game, because d6 pawn is pulling us down, right? We are unable to get rid of the d6 pawn. The only way for us to do so would be to either trade it for something or to play d5. None of that works, right? d5 is just gonna drop it. White otherwise is not gonna trade any of their pawns for d6, and black lost this game shortly after. So once again, we should have a certain thinking process here. When it comes to trading, you need to kind of ask yourself, what's the purpose of the trade, right? What are we trying to achieve? In this case, maybe black was afraid that the more pieces are remaining on the board, especially if the queens still remain, the more likely it is that black will eventually lose the d6. I feel like this was just a faulty logic, because it should work in exactly the opposite way. The more pieces we have, the more we can defend the d6. So if black was looking to get himself free from this curse of having to defend the d6 pawn, it should be done in some other more dynamic way. So I'm inviting you guys to try and find an amazing idea that would essentially solve most of black's problems, right? Once again, white, it's very likely that white is not looking to take on d6 as of right now, because like this would be literally the same as if white had taken on d6 here, right? This would have transposed into the same position, where it's not quite clear whether white is better or not. So white is not really threatening to take on d6 right now, which gives black just enough time to improve their position to the extent where they no longer have to worry about this d6 pawn hanging. So the question is now, how do we improve our position here as black? Which pieces, or what are we gonna try to improve here? Usually, if you see no clear plan on how to attack your opponent's weaknesses, and in this case, I guess we could argue that c2 pawn is a weakness. It's a backwards pawn, right? But we already know that white has this just magical move knight e3 that solves all of his problems, right? So even if you try to double on the c file, let's say like rook c6, knight e3 is all white needs to just white basically forgets about having to defend the c2 for quite some time now. Well, maybe not, because we can still potentially trade the knight away, so white would likely play something like f3 here. And once again, we're finding ourselves in this very, very passive situation where we're forced to keep defending the d6. Hey from sunny Saskatoon. Hello. Okay, so I see the right answer. Okay, Ansko is just a legendary hero. JMC, by the way, is asking how's Danish. I spoke to him on the phone today, and he is doing well. He is currently in Budapest, watching the Olympiad. Although the intention of his trip to Budapest was because of some family matters. It just so happened to be at the same time as Olympiad, so he got to enjoy some of the games. He got to enjoy watching the games in person. Ansko is absolutely correct. Black has just enough time to improve one of his worst pieces, which is the knight on d7. The move b5 allows black to do just that, as the knight is getting transferred onto possibly one of the weakest squares in white's position, the square on c4, which is now an outpost. Once again, queen d6 doesn't quite do much for white, as after this trade, rook b1, actually we have rook f2, which I didn't spot before, although it's still going to be a draw after this trade. Though we can argue that black is the one trying to win, like when I'm looking at the difference between rooks, I like my rook way more than I like white's. Okay, reality check is asking about the move queen to h3. Queen h3 is a good try, but once again, it's just way too easy to defend against it, right? White is just going to go ahead and play f3, followed by knight e3, and while it looks like our queen may be onto something, there's actually no follow-up, right? Because we just need the g4 square, which is no longer available. So our attack kind of comes to halt. We can keep trying, like we can try h5, but I think it's just way too easy. Like this for example would have been just the same structure. If we do decide to trade, we are still having issues with the d6. whenever you go for a piece trade, you never want to find yourself in a situation where you're only defending and nothing else, right? So you always want to leave yourself with an option, even if you do have to defend, even if there is no other way, you always want to leave yourself with an option of active defense. For all of you guys who have been here for Sarah's lecture, Sarah at some point mentioned that she doesn't know how to do active defense, and then for the next couple of moves she proceeded to do exactly that. You know, trying to stay humble. But active defense is very, very important. We need to make sure that we do not allow our opponent to run us over. We don't want to be a trampoline. We need to be able to fight back. Knight b8 and rook cd8, right? So this is a suggestion by Steve. Once again, a bit too passive. While it makes our situation a little bit better, once again, our pieces are just way too passive, and if we're trying to play d5, it's not going to happen, right? White will play knight e3, white will play c4. Our pawn is going to remain on d6, but after b5 is like a magical bean move that just makes our position so strong. Let's say white goes knight e3, we play knight b6. Once we plant our knight on c4, a couple of things will happen, right? So let's say white plays the move f3, which actually is the best thing they can do. Knight c4, knight takes, rook takes. And now if black doesn't take on d6 and doesn't go for this pawn trade, what ends up happening is that we have a massive difference between the white pieces, right? If you take a look at the bishop on b2 and compare it to our knight on f6, the bishop is actually not all that great, right? Also, we have secured the outpost on c4. We now have potential play on the c file, and also as the knights, as one pair of knights got traded away, we now have a possibility of playing rook d8 and d5, making sure that this knight comes into the center. So a lot of things are beginning to work our way, and Ante actually gives a crazy line here that after a4, black can just go ahead and play d5, because if takes, queen b6 check, king g2, rook takes b4, and then we end up taking on a4, winning a pawn, and actually we're just better there. Obviously, the position is still, quite playable for both sides, but we are now in command as we're going to be having material advantage. So the process of piece improvement, as opposed to trading pieces, can sometimes come in handy, right? So when you have a choice between trading and trying to maintain the pieces on the board, but trying to improve some of your worst pieces, that actually might be working better for you, especially in cases like these where your options are trade and suffer for the rest of the game, or don't trade, but then you have to find dynamic solutions like b5, where a lot of things will be hanging. Right? So b5 is a move that hangs at second pawn. So we need to kind of understand that, for example, this trade, if we trade the b5 pawn for the e4 pawn, this trade will almost always favor us, as we have just traded a side pawn for the central pawn. You guys probably all know that central pawns are way more important than pawns on the side in most cases, because whoever controls the center usually controls the flow of the game, as having a stronger center provides your pieces with more mobility, more space, and prevents your opponent's pieces from doing their best. So this is why b5 is so strong, because b5 is essentially invulnerable. It's never going to be a good trade for white. White would need to defend both e4 and c2 at the same time, and they don't have a move that does that. f3, once again, as we have already seen, leads to knight b6. And now if queen takes b5, once again, the b5 is not as important as c2, as getting our rook to c2 gives us a massive play, especially since white just played f3, beginning the second rank. So once again, don't trade pieces if it forces you to play defensively, right? That's a short explanation for this position, for this example. Moving on, I just love how how every position is from black's perspective, and it's not. Like, I'm pretty sure I made sure that it was from black's side, but whenever you upload it to Lichess, I guess it just shows it from white's perspective every time. Anyway, once again, black's perspective, it's black to play, and we have once again one of those cases of material imbalance. Black is down a whole exchange, and understandably so. Honestly, this is actually one of those examples where I understand why black did what they did. Grandmaster Anish Giri made the move queen to e3, which once again under normal circumstances makes very little sense, but here it makes sense to me. It may seem that this move forces white to trade, which is true, because if white doesn't take on e3, there are just way too many pawns hanging, and white will be losing one of them, right? So white is essentially forced to take on e3. And after this capture, it may seem as if e4 is about to die, right? The g2 bishop is under attack, e4 is under attack twice. If white moves the bishop, black will still go ahead and take on e4. As soon as e4 falls, chances are that f5 will fall as well. So in this case, Anish was likely hoping for the domino effect, right? Thinking that, oh, I'll go ahead and take on e4. Once I do, f5 will fall, and I'll restore material balance, kind of, right? Because black is down 2 points of material. Winning 2 pawns will bring it to equality. Unfortunately for Anish, there is now a very cool tactical resource that he clearly missed, and so did his opponent. So because his opponent missed it and played rook to e2, now Anish can postpone the capture, right? The knight is under attack. So Anish postponed the capture and played the move rook d3, which essentially allowed him to get a very, very pleasant position. By the way, a very nice intermezzo, knight to g4. Since black almost never wants to trade the rook, right? If black trades rooks, chances are that material, black will never regain material, and so throwing in knight g4 ensures that the g4 pawn is now weak, and that's something black can play against, alongside playing against the e4 pawn. So in this case, black is actually the one trying to win, because white has just too many weaknesses to take care of, and they can't really use their rooks for active purposes. So as we can see, something like this happens, and now the g4 is still suffering, right? There's still threats, such as bishop f3. This is why you see white pulling the rook back, trying to defend herself against this, but there is now, unfortunately, a different way of rerouting the bishop and capturing the g4. So this endgame happened, which is a drawn endgame, as this is rook n4 versus rook n3. But as things go, I'm sure some of you guys have seen last Olympiad's round 6 game between Grandmaster or world champion Ding Liren and Grandmaster Lim Lequang, where Lim got himself into a rook n2 versus rook n1 pawn endgame versus Ding Liren, and still ended up winning, even though the endgame was a theoretical draw. So chances are, that black can win these kinds of rook endgames, and he did. Anish did end up winning this game, as it is not easy. It's not easy holding a position for a draw, even if it's a theoretical draw. You still need to be very careful, because your opponent is always trying to make sure that you go wrong somewhere. So going back, what did Anish miss, right? So interestingly, after rook e2, knight g2 may seem like it's winning a lot of material back, right? Okay, if white captures on g2, there's bishop e4 with a fork. This just looks awful for white, right? Now, after this simple tactic, white is down a pawn, and the same goes for rook takes g2, there's still bishop takes e4 with a fork. So how come Anish didn't take on g2? What do you guys think? A little hint, if you take a look at the knight, it has nowhere to go now, right? And as we all know, the e4 is the main issue, right? The e4 has been hit twice. If white solves that problem, the g2 knight is not getting away. And if e4 is protected enough times, white will maintain an extra exchange, right? So the move that helps white defend e4 is not knight d2. Knight d2 would be a disaster because the rook is overwhelmed. It's knight c5. And now once again the knight is stuck on g2 and is going to get captured the very next move. So if you go back here, some of you guys may already know the issue with this trade, right? The issue with this trade is that white can begin with knight to c5, giving the e4 pawn an extra defender, and after black takes on g2, rook e2, ensuring the e4 pawn's safety. And once again, this knight is not getting out, so black would have to go for some kind of weird trade to make sure they still have some initiative going, and yet white is up in exchange, so they should be winning this game, you know, with proper technique. So sometimes piece trades lead to unexpected blunders, right? So queen e3 in this case is a blunder because you are not able to properly calculate the defensive mechanism that your opponent has, right? So you think that, oh, this piece trade reduces the amount of defenders of a weakness that I'm currently attacking, and my opponent cannot defend it properly after this trade. Sometimes this can lead to the missteps like this. So instead of queen e3, an obvious better move would be knight to e3, because it's doing exactly the same thing, right? We're still hitting the g2, but we are not letting white knight to come to c5, as we now have queen taking care of it. So a sample line goes like this, which sees us trading the rooks, trading one pair of rooks, and somehow, thanks to our queen still being in the game, we can claim that we now have sufficient compensation for an exchange. Because white, once again, white is currently using their rook as a defender mostly, and if that continues the same way, you know, the material advantage becomes irrelevant. Do remember that material advantage only matters as long as you can use it for active purposes. You want to win, you want your pieces to attack your opponent. If that's not what your pieces are doing, no matter the advantage you have, the chances are you're not going to win. A blunder is technical difficulty of your opponents. Okay, I mean, I guess you can say that. But just as an example, that this can happen too. Okay, moving on. Example number 4. This one is a simple one, I would say. This one is one of a more simple, at least it has a more simple explanation to it. If a trade of a piece is followed by a material gain, right? So just like in here, where white mistakenly traded the white pieces, thinking that, oh, well, you know, let's just go ahead and take the pawn on d6. Pawn on d4 also doesn't seem like it's going to survive for much longer. So let's do that. You know, let's win material right away. You know, we all know that chances are that the free stuff is not actually free. There is some kind of caveat. That's why I don't like receiving free gifts. I don't think I've ever won anything free, as a matter of fact, and I don't mind it, to be fair, because there is always a string attached to anything free. And just like in this game, the string attached was that black was getting a lot of counterplay. The move queen c4 is not just a simple threat of a check, it's also a threat of the capture on b3 because of, because it's a clearance for the a3 pawn. Once the a2 pawn is gone, and it will be gone during this trade, the a3 pawn is going to promote. The rook can't move out. It can't. If it moves out, a2 still dies, and white will still lose because of how far advanced the a3 pawn is. And so the only chance for white to actually not lose this game is to make sure the b3 rook is protected. So queen d5, which promptly leads into a perpetual. Trading pieces in order to win material can sometimes backfire if the material you capture gives up a lot of counterplay and initiative to your opponent's pieces. You should always ask yourself, is the material actually worth it, or will I be overwhelmed by having to defend myself? In this case, white could have actually won material easily by not trading. Right? So instead of taking on c7, we could have just moved the bishop out of the way. And the material white is going to be winning is the pawn on a3, as opposed to the pawn on d6. In my mind, winning the a3 makes a lot more sense, because a3 is black's potential counterplay, and also by capturing a3, we now have a possibility of connecting the passed pawns on the queen side. So once again, makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately for white, they failed to see through it, and the game ended with a draw instead of white winning easily. Moving on. This one is similar to example number 2. Because in the following position, white played, white having pieces that are naturally more passive. As we can see, black has a couple of things going their way. I think probably should use the red here. White probably thought to himself, oh, let's take it one step at a time and let's just trade everything. Because currently, let's say black's queen is looking quite annoying. So white went ahead and played king h2 is a good move. White played the move queen d3, which once again takes us back to example number 2, where black played queen c4, leaving themselves in a passive defense situation. So this is no different. While it seems that white doesn't have weaknesses in his position, they will. They will get some. After black takes, which didn't happen, because once again black was in this state of mind where they felt that they need to keep the pieces on the board. And actually it worked out. From practical perspective, keeping the pieces on the board does maintain the pressure, because your opponent has more things to worry about. But sometimes getting into a position like this one can be very, very dangerous for your opponent, as there's always going to be something to defend. In this case, the f5 pawn is going to fall, and the d5 is just so separated. I love Molotovs. What kind of comment is? I'm not sure I understand. Maybe lock this place up. That would make sense, but not the way it was said. Anyway, black doesn't get any tangible advantage. Right? Black is about to recapture an f5, But then what ends up happening is that d5 pawn begins getting hit. Right? Black has a very simple way of hitting the d5 as rook. Bishop is going to go away. The knight is going to join in. So white will always suffer having to defend the d5 for the rest of the game. I don't know what that means. If that's how you use it, if that's a verb you're using, I don't know what your message means. Please elaborate. Anyway, as a demonstration, right? So in this case, despite the fact on how annoying this position may seem, white would have been better off keeping the pieces on the board and once again taking it one step at a time, playing king h2, because king h2 does take care of the knight g3 threats. Bishop h4 leads into nothing, as we can simply just play bishop f2, trading bishops. You know, black doesn't have enough play, so white shouldn't be as worried. The same idea is no longer as plausible because now, as white king is out of the way, right, out of the first rank, white can try to go on the offensive, once again using the fact that both heavy pieces are available, doubling on the c file. And if black is not careful, by the way, move queen c7 is very fancy, right? We are now threatening rook b8, we are threatening rook b7, so we are having some action, it seems. Pieces are flying, knight on e1 is under 2 attacks, knight on h5 is also attacked as well. And as per usual, as soon as the dust settles, we'll probably be looking at some kind of draw here. Looks like this is it. And black just doesn't have enough pieces to keep attacking the e4. If anything, white will just bring the king over to f3. And once again, unlike the previous case where black does have quite a few pieces to apply pressure against d5, here, actually just defending it with a singular rook is more than sufficient for us to just kind of forget about it. All right. So once again, a reminder, don't leave yourself in a passive defense situation when you're going for piece trades. And last but not the least, this example right here. I especially like this one because it shows us how bad the passive defense is, and that whenever possible, you should always look for active defense. Like it's something that you should be doing regardless of how bad your position is. Like when it feels like defending is the only thing you can do, still look for active defense. Don't run yourself into the corner. Don't kill off your pieces, making them stuck defending something. Make sure your pieces are applying pressure. Make sure your pieces are fighting for their life. Don't leave them to die. And in this game, one of black's main advantages, once again, we have a material disbalance, but in terms of points, it's equal right now. Right? White has a piece and 2 pawns for a rook, so it's currently equal. Ansko is saying b4 and f4. Well, I'm afraid that I'm going to be promoting. So while this plan seems cool, as I was about to say, black's main strength here is a d3 pawn. If you don't do something about this pawn immediately, chances are that black will be promoting. And actually, just like in the game, oh man, there's a lot of bots today, huh? In the game, white played a very, very logical looking move, bishop f6, and began taking pawns on the king's side, not realizing that the d3 pawn is actually way, way more important than any of the pawns on the king's side. As if black ever reaches d2, rook c1 is to follow, and we will lose. Oh boy, we're getting bombarded by the bots. It's a trap, as Admiral Fish says. Pretty much. I wouldn't say black giving up or willingly giving up their pawns on the king side was something they deliberately went for, but it worked out nicely because, you know, it's always going to be kind of a judgment call when you are about to lose a good portion of your pieces, you know, just so that you can put all of your faith into this one idea. And in this case, the pawn on d3 is the biggest threat to white's position. So instead of going for extra material that doesn't matter in the long run, white should have played rook to d1, attempting to deal with the pawn immediately. After inevitable a6, no time to waste. We do not have time to retreat this knight, because in this case we cannot capture the d3 on time, and therefore here the only way for white to survive would have been to give up the knight and to play a reverse Uno card on black, where white says, well, you had your d3 pawn, but I have my d6 pawn, so let's see what can we do with it. d7, rook e8, bishop f6. Bishop f6 still being available to us is a very, very fortunate thing, because if we can make sure that most of these pawns are dead, then most of the rook versus rook and bishop endgames are going to be drawn for us. And this is why you see this weird line where we end up playing down the bishop, but in reality it's a very simple draw for white, because, as you guys may know, rook and bishop versus rook is a theoretically drawn endgame, plus here white has a couple of pawns, so black may not even end up winning most of them, right? If black plays their cards right, it should be possible for white to defend everything, which is a single rook. So it looks like I've done well in terms of time. I hope you guys enjoyed these examples. This was me, Ilya, and my lecture was about how to trade pieces properly. What we went over today is a couple of cases where before you trade your pieces, you need to identify whether the piece you're trading is good or not, and how it is compared to the piece of your opponent that you're trading for. Look at the material, right? If you're down material, you don't usually want to trade unless it is some kind of an exception. And lastly, you don't want to put yourself into a very unfortunate situation after the trade where you have to defend for the rest of the game. Thanks for joining me today. I wish you guys to have a great night. Take care. Peace.